First, I'm really honored and pleased to be here and on a meeting on sweetness. I've been working on sweetness a long time since my PhD, which was on sweetness. So it feels like the circle is round to some extent. Talking today about sweetness and health. It's also when I did my PhD, the issue of sweetness was highly prevalent, or there was a strong societal discourse about sweetness as being very bad, and then after my PhD in the 1990s, the attention drifted towards fat, and of course, for I think about 2 or 3 decades, the attention of nutritionists was focused on fat. But now it's back on sugar again, and the whole societal discourse is on sugar, and fat seems to be healthy and sugar seems to be bad, and 20 years ago it was the other way around. So it's interesting times. I first have a short background, then I'll go on to talk about our work and also the work of some others on the measurement of sweetness of diets, then come up with some results on whole diet sweetness exposure in relation to gender, in relation to body weight status, and also in relation to some typical examples of diets, different diets. Then I'll finish up with some work that we did ourselves on sweetness and satiation and the regulation of energy intake, and then I'll conclude with some work to be done. First, the background, we discussed that already in earlier talks. I think in the society you have the narrative that you need to cut down on sweetness, then you will lower your preference for sweetness, that will cause a lowering of sugar intake, that would lead to a lower energy intake, and then the prevalence of obesity will go down and the problem is solved. That doesn't work. But I think in the end, little is really known, and Catherine also showed that in her talk. I do think we do know a number of, or I think there's reasonable consensus in the scientific community about sweetness in general. I think there's pretty much agreement that sugar-sweetened beverages lead to an overconsumption of energy intake, and in the end also to a higher prevalence of obesity. I think there's also quite some data to suggest that low energy sweeteners help controlling energy intake. Of course, there are also lots of people who disagree with that, but I think when you look at systematic review and meta-analysis in the literature, I think there's pretty much consensus about it. What I also think is there's a lot of consensus about is there have been a large number of studies comparing obese and overweight people, comparing sweetness perceptions and sweetness preferences to normal weight people. And I think that work started in the 1980s already, and it continues up until this day. And I think most of these studies show that obese and normal weight people have similar sweetness perceptions and also similar sweetness preferences. I think what is all unknown is the role of sweetness exposure in the whole diet and its relation to energy intake and health. Can you measure the sweetness exposure of a whole diet? Can we do that in a reproducible, in a reliable way, and can we do that across populations and across countries and different cultures? I think the answer is yes. There's still a number of issues to be solved, and it's a lot of work, but I think in the end it can be done. I'll start off with a slide from my own dissertation about 30 years ago. This is showing the interaction between glucose and fructose in mixtures. And I'm not going to discuss the mixture interaction between glucose and fructose. This is in watery solutions, but I think this slide shows that you can measure sweetness in a very accurate way, in a very precise way. If you do it carefully enough, then you can very carefully construct psychophysical functions for fructose and glucose and all these mixtures. And this is actually differences in intensity compared to water, but I won't discuss the interval or ratio scale properties of this scale. But I think what you can see is that you can measure it quite accurately, and you can also detect subtle differences in perceived sweetness intensity in an accurate and reproducible way. Because when you talk about whole diets, then the issue is very different, because then we do not talk about watery solutions of sucrose, but you talk about complex foods with all the interactions and all the issues. I think so far there are 4 studies that looked at, or that created, I would say, a food taste database across hundreds of foods representative of a country's diet. One study has been done in the Netherlands, and we've done similar study in Malaysia. The group in France, in Dijon, they created a food taste database for France, and there's also work in Australia. The group in France, from Christophe Martin and Sylvie Essentiaux and Pascal Schlich, they created a food taste database on mixed dishes. So they asked people to rate the intensity, sweetness intensity, saltiness intensity of, say, sandwiches, of meals, of products that you consume as you consume it in the house. And they did that with a trained panel of about 10-15 people who consumed these foods across, I think, a number of weeks or months, and in the end they consumed in total 590 foods, and they created the taste database with the basic tastes and also fat sensation. We did it slightly differently. We asked people, we trained a panel in the Netherlands and Malaysia, and in the Netherlands we trained a panel and we asked them to rate the basic taste intensity and fat sensation of single foods as they appeared in a Dutch food composition database, which is linked to the Dutch food consumption survey. So we asked people to taste bread, to taste cheese. We also asked them to rate bread on cheese or cheese on bread, but that was limited. Mostly we rated single foods. And the study in Australia was designed in a similar way. They also rated single foods and then transposed it to the whole diet. And the study of Theo in Malaysia, they used both single foods and mixed dishes. How did that work? So based on food consumption surveys, we selected in Malaysia and in the Netherlands foods that comprised in total more than 80% of the total energy intake in that diet, and we did it on the basis of the food consumption surveys done in Malaysia and in the Netherlands. We used a modified spectrum method with standard concentrations of 2, 5, and 10 grams of sucrose and other sucrose per 100 milliliter in water. And we also added reference points on a visual analog scale of about 100 milliliter. So here you see the Dutch version of that scale, where we start with water, then R1 is 2 grams per 100 milliliter, R2 is 5 grams, and R3 is 10 grams. And we started with training the panel with simple solutions, and then we gradually made it more difficult with solid foods, with more complex foods. And in the end, we also had 5 reference foods on the scale. This is simple biscuits, this is vanilla custard, this is cake, this is marshmallows, and this is very sweet. This is condensed milk from Friesland Campina with, I think, about 60 or 70% of sugar in it, which is really, really sweet. So we trained the panel on this scale, and you train them until they become reproducible to a certain extent, and then we went on to scale all the foods, all the other foods. And we did that with a Dutch panel and with a Malaysian panel, and you can ask yourself the question, well, do the Dutch panel and the Malaysian panel, if you rate identical foods, do they come up with identical answers regarding the sweetness, the saltiness, the fattiness? And the answer is roughly yes. They are still humans, but this is the sweetness value of about 19 foods, identical foods, scored in Malaysia and scored in the Netherlands by the Dutch panel and by the Malaysian panel. And yeah, they not perfect, but well, close. So you see some deviations, but I think you can show that if you train a Dutch panel and train a Malaysian panel and give them identical foods by this method, you get more or less identical answers. Here you see a number of sensory profiles of in total 8 foods of these 19 identical foods on the basic tastes and on fat intensity. And what you can see, this is for instance chocolate sprinkles and Heineken beer. You see that these profiles of the Dutch and Malaysian panels, they overlap to a large extent. They are not identical, but yeah, I think they are fairly reliable and yeah, so not perfect, but good enough in order to go further and to look, I would say, at the taste intensity of a whole diet. I'll show you some data of different on these taste databases. This is a relationship between sweetness and different nutrient contents in the different food taste databases. Well, in the Netherlands, in Malaysia, in France, and in Australia, where we show that there's actually no correlation between sweetness intensity and calorie content. We would have expected so, but that's not the case. There is a relation between rated sweetness intensity and carbohydrate content across the food supply, and of course between sweetness content and sugar concentration is what you would expect, of course, but there's an inverse relation with sweetness and protein, sweetness and fat sensation, and sweetness and sodium concentration. I like this slide. This is the distribution of sweetness intensities across these hundreds of foods in France, in Malaysia, and in the Netherlands. And for me, it's quite striking that you see that these distributions are not identical, but they are more or less similar. And what's also striking for me is that these sweetness intensities are not that high. If you compare it to the possible range of sweetness intensity going from water to sickeningly sweet to a very high intensity, I think these ranges are, I think the possible scale would probably be up to 150 or something, but you don't see that. People don't consume foods which are above 100 on this scale. So I think and a similar thing applies for saltiness. I think when you look at the saltiness range of the foods consumed in these countries, these are also fairly narrow compared to what you could achieve with adding or salt in the diet. So then you can go on and to look whether can you characterize the sweetness of a whole diet. We did that in the Netherlands in a particular way. What we first did, we had the database of about 470 foods, and we did a cluster analysis to divide these foods in different taste clusters. And what you then get is in total 6 different food clusters. One cluster is sweet and sour, where you have most of the fruits in. Then you have a group which we named neutral, like bread and potatoes and rice and pasta, which don't have a very sweet taste, neither very umami or salty or fatty, and they are neutral in many respects. Then we have a cluster with fat taste, like mayonnaise, a small cluster with bitter taste, like coffee, but also beer is in that group. Then you have quite a big group of salt, umami, fatty taste, and in the Netherlands it's typically things like cheese, but also crisps and other foods. And finally you have a sweet fat cluster, which I think prototypical example is chocolate, which is fat and sweet. And what you can do then is to link the intakes of these clusters and link that to individuals in in the food consumption survey, and then you can look at the contribution of the different taste clusters to the total energy intake of these groups of people, like men and women, people with different weight status, and that's the way you can calculate these intake. We did that with the Dutch food consumption survey, and we also have access to dietary assessment methodology study, where we compared dietary recalls with food frequency measures, and we did similar analysis with the dietary recall and with the food frequency, and we end up with similar results there. But I'll show you first the results of men and women of both the food consumption survey and the dietary assessment methodology study, where we show that women in general have slightly higher contribution of sweet, sour, and sweet fatty foods to the total energy intake of these diets. And that's what we see in the food consumption survey, but also in that methodology study. So these are two independent samples, but we actually obtain similar results. And also the food frequency study in the dietary assessment methodology study yielded similar results, in the sense that women consume more sweet foods than men. This is the relationship with weight status and the intake from sweet fat and sweet sour foods. And what this shows is that obese, overweight people consume slightly less sweet foods compared to normal weight people. So it's very clear, and that's also true in both in the Dutch National Food Consumption Survey and the dietary assessment methodology status. Actually, this was for men, and here you see the same slide for women, and there you see the pattern is actually the same, in the sense that overweight and obese people tend to consume less sweet foods compared to normal weight women. What is also, I think, interesting to do is that we compared, looked at dietary patterns, and also the taste in different dietary patterns. And what we looked is we compared the taste profile of the Dutch Wheel of Five, which is the recommended dietary pattern in the Netherlands, with the average dietary pattern, but also with the Mediterranean diet and with the Paleolithic diet. And I think I find the results quite interesting. So we reproduced it also with the help of the Netherlands Nutrition Center, so in order to get a realistic figure of the Dutch dietary guidelines. And of course we knew the average pattern from the Dutch food consumption survey. What you then get is, I think is very interesting. This is the pattern of an average Dutch person, where you see that there's a big portion coming from neutral foods, but there's some coming from sweet sour. There's also about 15-20% coming from sweet fat. There's a big chunk coming from salty, umami, fatty foods, about 20-25%. If you look at the recommended Dutch diet, then you see overall it's much more neutral, and has much less taste. That's of course that's what you probably would expect. But I think that for me there's a very illustrative figure or it helps me to understand why people find it very difficult to adhere to a dietary pattern which is recommended. You see.
What are neutral foods? What does neutral mean in this context?
It's the wheat category.
She's
asking what the neutral category means.
Neutral, that's foods like bread and potatoes and wheat and these foods that the staple foods, which don't have an articulate sweet, umami, fatty or bitter taste.
They have a starch taste?
Probably, yes. But we don't know how to rate it. That's a difficult thing. Yeah. No, but it's typically all those foods which you combine with others, I would say. like bread and potatoes and rice and things. The Paleolithic diet looks much more, in comparison, it looks much more to the average taste pattern in the Netherlands. So probably maybe more attractive. I'll go on with a few studies that we did. Of course, one of the issues on sweet taste is also that sweetness promotes energy intake, or that's one of the narratives. And we looked at that a couple of years ago in one study. I must say, I almost forget about this study until this issue came along on sweetness and satiation. And then I realized we did that study about 10 years ago, where we looked at two different meals, a rice meal and one which was made savory with herbs, so that you get a kind of, and in the Netherlands we call it nasi goreng, kind of Indonesian type of flavor, really savory. And the other rice meal, we made it with vanilla, that you can kind of rice dessert with cinnamon and that type of stuff. But what you then really can do, you can have the texture is equal, of course the macronutrient content is equal, fiber, energy density, everything is equal, except one meal is very savory and the other meal is very sweet. And we just compared ad libitum intakes between these two meals, and we had three different methodological setups with different types of appetite ratings and questions asked in between the meal before and after. So this was done with 64 persons, and if you then look at the results, then what you actually see is that the intakes of the sweet and savory meals are identical. And so this is, in total, this is 180 subjects, exactly the same. So the energy intake or grams intake, whether it's from sweet or savory foods, when they're equally palatable, similar texture, similar macronutrient content, nothing happens in terms of energy intake. I think the texture is much more determinative in driving intake than the taste. We also, a few years later, we looked at more satiety and the effect of either having people to consume a totally sweet diet or a totally savory diet or something in between for one day. And then we looked at, we started one day at lunch. We gave them only sweet foods for the rest of the day and also for the next breakfast and the next morning snack. And then we ended up with an ad libitum lunch. And so we looked at whether the taste of the diet had an effect on the lunch ad libitum intake one day after. This was done with about 39 subjects. And we measured appetite for something sweet, appetite for something savory, and ad libitum intake at lunch 24 hours after the start. And what you can see is, I think what you would also expect, this is appetite for something sweet. And with a sweet diet, it goes down, and with a savory diet, it stays constant. And after one day on a sweet diet, people really get some appetite for something savory. And of course, it's also the other way around. If you give people, if you ask for appetite for something savory, when you give them a savory diet, appetite for something savory goes down, but appetite for something sweet stays up. And after one day, people consuming only savory foods, they really get appetite for something sweet. So I think people seek a balance in their diet, seeking savory and sweet foods, and that's of course the phenomenon of sensory-specific satiety, which is, I think, very, very strong. If you then look at the intake, ad libitum intake of that lunch after one day, you also see no effect in total energy intake, but you do see a shift from sweet foods towards savory foods. So after the savory diet, people consume less savory foods and more sweet foods, and after the sweet diet, it's exactly the other way around. So I think there's a strong sensory-specific satiety effect, but there's no evidence that sweetness in itself promotes intake. And I think when you're exposed to a sweet taste, yeah, you get also satiated for that taste, and you also get a full feeling. So the idea that, and I think everybody would understand that if I give you a sweet diet for 24 hours or for 48 hours, you will get bored with it very quickly. So if you are on a sweetness-only diet, I think that will be also very effective for weight loss, because you get sick of it after some time. So the idea that sweetness promotes intake, I think that, yeah, there's no evidence for that. I think, what type of work could be done after this? I think you can determine the sweetness of a diet in a fairly accurate way. I think there's various ways to do it. In the study of Lees et al., David Cox and Camilla Swartz, what they did, they looked at the frequency of foods and the grams of foods, total intake, and they multiplied that by the intensity, and they added up all these numbers, and then you get a kind of overall sweetness exposure in the diet. I think that's a sensible way to do it. We first did it into taste clusters, divided the foods into taste clusters, and then calculated the contribution of these taste clusters to energy intake. That's more a nutritional perspective, for which I feel quite familiar with and comfortable with. For me, I think that what I would think would be probably the best way to do is to get a kind of measure of the intensity of sweetness of all the foods that people consume, and then also look at the duration of consumption that people have for these foods. And I think eating rate has a very important role in that. You can have, for instance, with fruits it's very clear. You have apples or apple juice, but of course the sweetness exposure to apples is much, much longer than the sweetness exposure to apple juice. And while the sugar content and the total sugar intake is, of course, more or less the same, but the exposure time to the sweetness can vary by maybe a factor 10 or 15 when you eat apples or when you consume apple juice. So I think you have to take the duration of sweetness exposure into account when you want to calculate the overall exposure to the diet. But that's quite some work, but I think it's doable to do. What can you do? I think possibly a way forward would be to standardize sweetness measurements across countries or across different groups, relate that to food composition tables and also to food consumption surveys. I think that, of course, here in America you have the NHANES study, which is probably linked to food composition table here in America. And I think if you have a sensory panel, then you could fill that food composition database with taste values, and you can link that to the enhanced data of consumption, and then you can come up with, I would say, the sweetness intensity of the American diet. I would be very curious to see whether, because there are all types of stories that sweetness in America is much bigger than in Europe, but we don't have the data, but I think we should have the data to verify that and to make up conclusions. And I think what could also be done is to carry out more controlled nutrition intervention studies in which you vary, I would say, the sweetness part of that diet and look at ad libitum energy intake. I think that's also doable to do. Of course, that's also a lot of work, but I think you can answer the question that whether sweetness has an effect on energy intake or not. And I think that's also doable to do. And of course, you could carry out these nutrition intervention study. You could do it short-term, much more controlled, where you have people in-house and feed them and record every food item that they eat. Or you could do it less extensively, like the two studies that are currently going on or set up, where you do that for a much longer time, but you are less precise in your in measurement and control. But I think both are feasible, and doable. So I think, yeah, in order to rationalize this discussion, I think it would be worthwhile to proceed with this type of work. And looks very exciting to me to answer these questions. And I think we will be able to answer these questions in a reliable way. I'm quite certain about that. But I do think that everybody would know that if you have a very high sweet diet, yeah, that won't promote, I would say, a very high energy intake. So, yeah, but, well, the societal discourse is, of course, different, but we need to provide scientific evidence to, rationalize that discussion so that all this crap doesn't enter into food policies, huh? Because then we are further away from home, and I don't think that's good. So, thank you.